Hello and welcome back to the Thecrimereel. For this week's true crime story, we shall be visiting southern Texas to look into the case of Irene Garza. Nicholas and Josephina Garza owned a dry cleaning business in McAllen, Texas. On November the 15th, 1934, they welcomed a baby girl into the world. They named their daughter Irene. Irene had a happy childhood, and by the time she was a teenager, her parents' business had become quite successful, allowing them to move from their home in the south side of McAllen to the more affluent area on the northern side of the city. Irene attended McAllen High School. The majority of the students at the school were white, and Irene was the first Latina student to become a twirler and head drum majorette. She later attended Pan American College at the University of Texas, where she was homecoming queen. She was a beautiful, sensitive and shy young lady, and at the age of 24 was crowned the 1958 Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. After being the first person in her family to attend college and graduate, Irene became a school teacher, working with some of the area's most disadvantaged children. She often spent her salary on books and clothing for her students, and would work early mornings and into the evening to give the children extra education and fun activities. She was a devout Catholic and took great comfort from her faith. She attended communion and mass daily, which she felt gave her courage, faith and happiness. A letter that Irene wrote to an old friend, postmarked April 9th, 1960, described how she had made quite a few friends in the previous year and was feeling happier than she had ever been. She described receiving attention from a few young men, including an ex-boyfriend, Sonny Martinez, who had sent her several cards and chocolates on the previous Valentine's Day. Irene also talked of how she was gaining great fulfillment from her work, having recently been appointed as the secretary of the Parent-Teacher Association. This role was helping her to overcome her shyness. She spoke with great fondness of the children that she taught and had a true passion for educating some of the area's most deprived children to give them the best opportunities for their future. Admired by many for her beauty, kindness and elegance, Irene was incredibly humble and caring of those around her. She told her friends that she hoped to marry and have a large family one day, but was in no hurry for this to happen, instead concentrating on her teaching and her church. On Saturday, April 16th, 1960, the day before Easter Sunday, Irene had been busy preparing Easter baskets and was helping to plan the Easter egg hunt for the children of the parish, which was due to take place the following morning. At approximately 6:30 p.m, Irene borrowed the family car to go to confession at Sacred Heart Church in McAllen. She told her mother that she would not be out for long and drove the 12 blocks to the church. Many people saw her arrive that evening. One person noticed Irene make the sign of the cross as she entered. Another saw her kneeling by herself in a pew in the 5th row. As it was Easter weekend, the confession lines and pews at the church were full of visitors. The regular churchgoers, along with children back for the holidays, and many Catholics who practice their faith only at Easter and Christmas. A fellow parishioner remembered speaking to Irene to ask if she could go in front of her in the lengthy confession line as she was running late. Irene happily obliged. Several people remember Irene placing a white veil over her head whilst waiting for confession. Irene was wearing a sleeveless lavender blouse, a pleated flower skirt and beige shoes. She was also carrying a black patent handbag. No one can recall seeing Irene leave the church. Irene would always call her parents if she expected to be out after midnight. So when she didn't come home on that Saturday evening, they initially thought that she had gone to midnight mass and had simply forgotten to call. However, when Irene still hadn't returned home by 3 a.m. on Sunday the 17th, her parents feared that something was wrong. Her father, Nicholas, drove to the church and found her car parked a couple of blocks away. He then went to the McAllen Police Department to report his daughter missing. The police returned with Nicholas to look at the car. Upon investigation, they found that only the passenger door was unlocked. By this time, the Garza family were frantic. They called around friends and acquaintances to see if anyone had any knowledge as to where their daughter could be. Later that morning, April 17th, 1960, Irene's disappearance was broadcast to all nearby police agencies. It stated, "Attempt to locate, foul play feared. Irene Garza, white, female, 25, 5 feet 4 inches, 118 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, wearing lavender blouse, flowered skirt, tan shoes, last seen McAllen 9 p.m, April 16th. The day passed without any further news, but then on Monday, April 18th, an Edinburgh school teacher found Irene's handbag in a field near the intersection of Farm to Market Road 495 and North McColl Road. He opened the bag and realised that it belonged to Irene, so took it straight to her house. Due to the condition of the bag, investigators determined that it must have been dropped sometime after the heavy rainfall that had occurred the previous day. On the same day, just a few hundred yards from where the bag had been found, a passerby discovered Irene's left shoe on an empty stretch of the McColl Road. Her lace headscarf was then found just a short distance away from the shoe. Irene's disappearance and the discovery of these items led to one of the biggest searches in the area's history, involving police officers, deputies, the National Guard and local volunteers. Nicholas and Josephina Garza received a call from a woman claiming to be Irene, stating that she had been kidnapped and was being held hostage in a small hotel in the nearby city of Hidalgo. Dozens of police raced to the hotel only to discover that the call was a hoax. An Edinburgh waitress then came forward after one of her customers claimed that he had killed Irene. Again, upon further investigation, it was proved that this was a so-called joke from a man who had been drinking heavily. For 72 hours, hundreds of people searched the farmlands, orchards and canals in the McAllen area. House-to-house inquiries were made. Divers dragged irrigation canals and border patrol planes joined the search. On the morning of Thursday, 21st of April 1960, the search came to a heartbreaking end. At 7:40 a.m, the McAllen Police Department received a call that reported a woman's body had been seen floating in the 2nd Street Canal. Irene was positively identified later that morning. She was still wearing most of the clothes that she had worn to confession 5 days earlier. The subsequent autopsy determined that she had been physically assaulted, beaten and suffocated. Due to the level of decomposition, it was determined that she had probably been held captive for up to a day before she died. She was not alive when she had been dumped in the canal. Due to the time that she had been in the water, any physical evidence had been washed away. Residents of Macallan were extremely worried as they had a murderer in their midst. Speculation and rumours were rife. There were whispered conversations that the murderer was a priest, which caused great concern among this religious community. Officials questioned over 500 people across several southern Texas cities. Multiple polygraph examinations were conducted, and a reward of $2,500 was posted for any information which led to the arrest of the murderer. This reward was the largest sum ever offered in that area and was later increased to $10,000. Despite extensive efforts, police found little in the way of evidence. Their only clue was a muddy shoe print on the bank of the 2nd Street Canal, 4 blocks away from the spot where Irene had been found. Inside the footprint there was a strand of Irene's hair. It was surmised by those people involved in the case that this was the location where the killer had unloaded Irene's body from a car, dumping her into the water below. The police could also make out a faint imprint which they believed was made by Irene's petticoat, as well as some tyre tracks on the banks of the canal. The efforts of police were hampered by the heavy rain that had fallen in the area in the previous few days. Despite their best efforts and the making of casts, police could only extract minimal information from the shoe print. They decided that it was most likely a man's shoe between the sizes of 8 and 11. Over the following 6 days, the canal where Irene had been found was drained. On April 27th, police investigators recovered a light green Eastman Codaslide 35mm viewer. This viewer had an electric cord plug attached. It was found very close to where they believed Irene's body had been dumped into the canal. Initially unsure whether this item had any bearing on the case, Macallan Police Chief Clint Mussey told reporters that they were doing everything possible to run down any lead which might be even remotely connected with the crime. However, throughout their relentless investigation, one name kept coming to their attention: John FEIT, spelt F-E-I-T. He was a 27-year-old priest who had recently finished his seminary training in San Antonio. He was a visiting priest at the Sacred Heart Church. FEIT was the person who had heard Irene's last confession. This confession had taken place in the church rectory, a fact that was seen as very inappropriate by other members of the clergy. It also came to light that Nicholas and Josephina had visited FEIT the day after their daughter's disappearance. FEIT claims that they were asking about Irene's confession and whether anything had happened that could have upset her. However, a Garza family member has stated that Nicholas was asking FEIT, "What have you done with my daughter?" On the evening of Irene's disappearance, churchgoers reported that Father FEIT's confession line moved particularly slowly, and he was seen leaving the sanctuary several times. This was seen as unusual by many. Later in the evening, fellow priests noticed scratch marks on FEIT's hands when he returned for midnight mass. FEIT was brought in for questioning after it was discovered that he had purchased the exact same Codaslide viewer several months earlier. During questioning, FEIT initially denied having heard Irene's confession in the rectory that evening, but he later changed his story to admit that this did in fact happen. He explained that his confession line was particularly long and he had left the sanctuary because he had broken his glasses due to a habit of nervously playing with them when hearing confession. FEIT also said that he had returned to the pastoral house to retrieve another pair of glasses, but when he arrived he realised he did not have a key. He then had to climb into the house through a second-floor window, explaining that this was how he had sustained the scratches to his hands. FEIT also underwent 2 days of intense questioning for a polygraph test, during which he was often evasive and at times almost appeared to be baiting his interrogators. He was controlling his breathing and purposely trying to defeat the recordings. Examiners had secretly monitored FEIT's breathing rate during normal conversations, where they found that, on average, he inhaled and exhaled 16 to 20 times per minute when he wasn't being monitored. This is in contrast to the time when he was hooked to the polygraph machine, when he would always take exactly 10 breaths per minute. The polygraph examiner was convinced that FEIT was involved in the crime. According to the police report, it stated that, in their opinion, FEIT was responding in a manner that would indicate beyond doubt that he was concealing facts and had guilty knowledge. However, polygraph exams were not admissible in court and therefore provided no further evidence. Furthermore, investigators learned of an attempted physical assault which had occurred 3 weeks prior to Irene's disappearance. On the evening of March 23, 1960, a young Latina woman named Maria America GUERRA was attacked from behind while she knelt praying inside the Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh. This was just 12 miles away from the church in McAllen. The attacker tried to stuff a rag in her mouth whilst pushing her down to the floor. She managed to bite down hard on the attacker's finger, giving her enough time to escape. The investigators on Irene Garza's case re-interviewed Maria GUERRA, who confirmed that her attacker was a priest who was wearing horn-rimmed glasses. It was soon discovered that John FEIT had not only been at the Edinburgh church on the day Maria was attacked, but he completely matched the description that Maria had given of her attacker. The police continued to maintain publicly that they had no hard leads, but behind the scenes were concentrating all of their efforts on John FEIT. FEIT was described as bright and well-mannered, and he delivered his sermons in Spanish with ease. Parishioners, however, described him as aloof and a bit of a loner. He seemed quite ambivalent towards his profession, never describing it as a deep faith or a calling, but more of something that he wanted to try. Rumours that a priest was involved with both crimes continued to circulate around McAllen, but the subject was only ever broached discreetly in hushed whispers. Priests, as men of God, were held in very high regard and were viewed as absent of moral failings. The general feeling among the congregation was that if you wanted to remain a Catholic, you should not be discussing these rumours, not even thinking about them. Catholic leaders dreaded the fallout if one of their own was to be found guilty of murder. At this point, FEIT was always accompanied by Father O'Brien to every interview, and it seemed clear that Father O'Brien had been tasked with looking out for FEIT by its supervisors. Even without a confession, investigators felt that they had more than enough evidence to charge John FEIT with the murder of Irene Garza, but this simply did not happen. However, prosecutors did decide to move forward with the case against FEIT for the attempted attack on Maria GUERRA. The trial was held in Austin District Court, as it was determined that FEIT would not receive a fair trial in Hidalgo County, where McAllen is located. The trial ended with a hung jury, deadlocked 9-3 in favour of conviction. In order to avoid a second trial, FEIT pleaded no contest to the reduced charge of aggravated assault and was ordered to pay a $500 fine and $27.90 in court costs. The assumption by many in McAllen was that FEIT took this deal to avoid further embarrassment and negative publicity for the church. No charges were filed against FEIT for the murder of Irene Garza. Gradually, law enforcement moved on to other cases and the newspapers stopped reporting on the story. In the south side of the city, where injustice was often seen as an accepted fact of life, the whispers continued as to whether a deal had been struck to make this scandal disappear. FEIT was sent to a monastery with Father O'Brien promising Irene's family that the church would punish FEIT if it found that he had done wrong. Father O'Brien is rumoured to have told Nicholas and Josephina that the church's punishment was greater than any sentence that could be handed down by the courts. In 1963, FEIT was sent to Assumption Abbey, a monastery in Missouri. He was put in the care of a monk by the name of Dale Turkini, who was informed that he needed to support FEIT and train him to be a monk. While he was there, FEIT confessed to Turkini that he had hurt one young lady and murdered another. Turkini said that he felt that it was not his job to judge FEIT, and as such, this confession was not reported to the authorities. Once it was clear that FEIT was never going to be a monk, Turkini was given the job of ensuring that FEIT would not be a danger once he left the monastery, a role that Turkini was by no means qualified for. FEIT was later sent to a treatment retreat for troubled priests in New Mexico, where he worked his way up to a supervisory role. In 1970, FEIT left the priesthood and married a young lady called Mary that he had met at a church in Albuquerque. He moved to the Phoenix area with his wife, and they soon became parents to 2 daughters and a son. For several years, he worked as an insurance salesman. Sometime in the early 80s, FEIT began volunteering at local churches and continued to live a supposedly normal life with his wife and 3 children. He retired in the early 2000s. Contrastingly, any normality in Nicholas and Josephina Garza's life had been completely destroyed. They both passed away in the 1990s, having never seen anyone prosecuted for their daughter's murder. However, thanks to some dogged determination on the part of Naomi Ponce Sigler, a cousin of Irene Garza, this case was about to be revitalized. Naomi contacted Sonny Miller, a detective with the McAllen police force. He agreed to pull all the old files on Irene's murder to see if he could shed any light on the case. He soon found more evidence, but to his and Naomi's frustration, the district attorney still had no interest in filing charges. Miller also found that in the years following Irene's murder, everyone lost interest or was told to lose interest in the case. Sometime after the initial investigation in the 1960s, candlesticks from the Sacred Heart Church had been discovered near the canal where Irene had been found. These were never compared to the wounds on Irene's head. Naomi and Miller talked to many people involved or aware of the initial investigation, and it was clear that there was so much frustration that a man everyone considered guilty had walked free. It would seem that for whatever reason, the powers that be had not wanted a priest put on trial for murder and assault. Separately from Naomi's and Miller's investigation, in 2002, the Texas Rangers had formed a cold case unit, and McAllen's police chief had asked them to review Irene's case. The hope was that with the developments in technology and DNA testing, this would allow them to secure a conviction. DNA tests were performed on the clothes that Irene had been wearing when she was murdered, but they had been in the water for too long and no DNA was discovered. Once again, it looked like this cold case was never going to be solved. Meanwhile, Dale Tacchini, the monk from Missouri, was feeling conflicted about the fact that he had remained silent over FEIT's confession for all of these years. He decided that the time had come for him to make amends. Tacchini contacted George Sadler, a detective with the San Antonio police, advising him about FEIT's confession 40 years earlier to a murder that took place at Easter in the early 1960s. However, because FEIT had arrived at the monastery from San Antonio, Tacchini believed the murder had taken place in San Antonio and not McAllen. The letter that Tacchini sent to police had so many details that if it was true, it would have been possible to corroborate with physical evidence. However, due to the confusion over the location, the connection wasn't made with Irene's murder. By chance, a visiting Texas Ranger saw the list of cases that George Sadler was working on and commented about a similar case his partner was looking into as part of the cold case unit. Finally, this led to a break in the case when they realised that the two cases were one and the same. In 2002, Father O'Brien also came forward with additional information. He finally confirmed that he had suspected FEIT of Irene's murder at the time it happened. He also told police that FEIT had confessed to him in the summer of 1960 that he had killed Irene. With this new evidence in hand, it felt as though there was finally enough to prosecute FEIT for the murder of Irene Garza. However, once again this was not to be. The Hidalgo County District Attorney, RENE GUERRA, believed that the case was untriable. He questioned Tacchini's details of FEIT's confession and also questioned whether the investigators had fed Tacchini any details of the case. In addition, the district attorney questioned whether Father O'Brien's version of events was credible, as by this stage he was suffering from a form of dementia. Finally, in March 2004, after pressure from Irene's family and months of negative publicity, RENE GUERRA reluctantly agreed to bring the case to the grand jury. He appointed 2 prosecutors to handle the case, but from the start something didn't feel right about the way it was conducted. FEIT was never subpoenaed. Neither were the 2 main witnesses, Dale Tacchini or Father O'Brien. The grand jurors were simply given audio tapes and transcripts of their interviews. In June 2004, the grand jury decided not to indict John FEIT for the murder of Irene Garza. Another decade went by without any justice for Irene and allowing FEIT 10 more years of his freedom. This started to change in 2014. Rick Rodriguez campaigned to unseat GUERRA as the next district attorney, promising to review Irene's case once elected. However, time was running out. Father O'Brien had died in 2005 at the age of 77, and the last remaining witness, Dale Tacchini, was at this point 87 years old. FEIT himself was now in his 80s. He was a retired grandfather living in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he volunteered at a food bank. Those who knew him at the food bank viewed him as a kind, compassionate and caring man. However, those who had tried to interview him over the years found him to be quite the opposite. Finally, in February 2016, Rick Rodriguez brought the case to a new grand jury, and this time, FEIT was indicted. He was arrested and charged with murdering Irene Garza. FEIT appeared in the courtroom using a walker and entered a plea of not guilty. Despite the defence team requesting a $100,000 bail bond due to their client's age, and the fact that FEIT had stage 3 kidney and bladder cancer, spinal stenosis and diabetes, Judge Louis Singletary set the bond at $1 million. After a series of delays, the trial finally started in November 2017. None of FEIT's family members were present in court. On December 7th, 2017, the jury spent 6 hours deliberating before returning their verdict. An astonishing 21,054 days after Irene Garza went missing, John FEIT was found guilty of her murder. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read out, removing his hearing aid in what was seen as a final act of defiance. Despite FEIT's defence attorney recommending probation due to the lack of any criminal activity on his part in the years since Irene's murder, the prosecution requested a sentence of 57 years. It was a symbolic amount reflected of the time that he had evaded prosecution. On December the 8th, 2017, at the age of 85, he was sentenced to life in prison. He remains incarcerated in Texas to this day. I hope you found this story interesting. 57 years is an incredibly long time. I shall be uploading another true crime story next Wednesday. Until then, goodbye.